Basu Godin Notebook. 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 Basu Godin. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this new edition of the Basu and Godin Notebook. We're recording this one on Tuesday. It was a public holiday yesterday. Lots of busy stuff happening on both ends, both for Arpin and I. So thanks for your patience, everybody, and hope that it'll be worth it. So you had a good long weekend, Arpin?
Yeah, I did. Some family time on Journée des Patriotes or Victoria Day, depending on where you're listening to this podcast from. Just wanted to mention one thing from the last episode. I wanted to publicly apologize to Beckett Seneca for mispronouncing his name for an entire episode. Sorry, as someone who's had my name mispronounced for the better part of my life, I can appreciate, and you as well in the States, when you have to go with Godin whenever you're.
Yeah, I know. I have no choice. I have no choice.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I wouldn't see the end of it.
Yeah, exactly. The first time I heard you do that, I laughed. But anyhow, it's sorry to Beckett Seneca. It's Seneca, not Seneki. Apologies for that. So today's episode comes on the heels of the Edmonton Oilers completing the Final Four in the NHL Stanley Cup Playoffs tournament. And so we thought we'd look at those four teams through the lens of what the Canadiens are trying to build, trying to accomplish, and see how pertinent their playoff success has been, because the Canadiens' number one priority in any evaluation they make of any player is how will this player perform in the playoffs. It guided their selection of Juraj Slafkovsky, number one overall. It guided their selection of David Reinbacher at number 5 overall. And will likely guide their choice at number 5 overall this year as well. So let's go through the final four teams quickly. We won't do an immensely deep dive, but see how.
No, because we got other topics to cover after that too.
Well, we got other topics. We got your mailbag questions, which there are again numerous. So let's start with that. So let's start in the Eastern Conference. Mm-hmm. Rangers, Panthers. I don't know. I look at the Rangers and, what we're trying to do here is see, can the Canadiens somewhat replicate what these teams have done in terms of building playoff style teams? And the Rangers seem to me, they have the ultimate goaltending piece, which I don't think when they drafted Igor Shesterkin, they knew that they would drafted their goaltender of the future. It took a long time for that to happen. Yeah. We've talked about it a lot, obviously, that the key moment for this Rangers build was signing Artemi Panarin, which is arguably the best UFA signing, definitely of the last 10 years, probably. But, I think Marian Hossa would be up there when the Blackhawks signed him, but one of the best UFA signings of all time, really. But aside from that, if you look at how the Rangers are built, they have a lot of very good players of kind of various ages. They have a defense core that's obviously led by a superstar in Fox. Do the Canadiens have a piece like that? That's hard to say. But I think the general vibe of that team, I think is attainable for the Canadiens. It's just that one big piece. Are they going to be able to add it at the right time? The way the Rangers did, and even then, I think you could argue that the Rangers did it a bit earlier than they probably would have otherwise, just because the Panarin situation presented itself to them. And obviously Jeff Gorton being the guy who signed Panarin and being the guy who's in charge of the Canadiens along with Ken Hughes, that parallel is easy to make, but it's, you look at the Rangers and the coaching fit, the style of play, and the way that all the players seem to fit the way Peter Laviolette wants them to play is kind of the biggest aspect to me. But from a talent perspective, I don't feel like it's that inconceivable the Canadiens could do something similar to what the Rangers have done.
No, but the fact that the team has been originally assembled by the guy who's now the head of hockey operations in Montreal forces us to take a good look at the Rangers, because even if you are not able to match, well, this player could be that player in Montreal and basically make a roster equivalency. I
Mm-hmm.
think that the idea behind how to build your team and turn a rebuilding team into a contender is definitely a good example. And you were mentioning the Panarin signing that maybe was done a year earlier than what the Rangers had thought. I know that within the Montreal Canadiens brass, between Gorton and Kent Hughes, it's been a talking point, looking at how the Rangers had decided to jump in and just say, well, this is our opportunity and we have to seize it now because it might not represent itself later on. So I think that, I mean, barring the unforeseen possibility that let's say a guy like Leon Draisaitl becomes available on the market in the summer of 2025, not sure if there's going to be a UFA of Panarin's caliber that's going to be available to the Canadiens. But if they've got an opportunity, for sure they'll need to strike. But in the meantime, I mean, you look. What I like about the Rangers is the fact that they've got both the elite personnel and the depth. You know, for the number of times that we discussed, you know, are we better off looking at teams that are strong link or weak link? I think that they did a good thing. They did a good job at creating both, and when it's the shades of the Tampa Bay Lightning when they had like that solid bottom six in the years that they won the cup. Well, the fact that now the Rangers have a guy like Barclay Goodrow, even though that he's probably overpaid for what he's doing on that club, is a testament to that. Then they added Will Coyle is a very energetic young player. I mean, they added guys like Wenberg too, who's decent complementary player. I think that there's that I think that comes into play. But really what strikes me the most about the Rangers is the fact that it's their veterans who are carrying them. And it's unusual that you have a team that tried to rebuild, that had some very, very high draft picks, but ultimately, you know, it's Chris Kreider who's still going at it at 33. It's Vincent Trocheck who's having a career year at 30. I mean, it's quite striking, and they didn't have to rely too much on Alexis Lafrenière, and thank goodness for them, not on Capocaco either. So Lafrenière is coming into his own, but he's coming into his own as a player who's well surrounded. So there's not too much pressure that's been put on the young players, and that's a good lesson there. I think that you want to bank on your high draft picks and make sure that you're able to turn them into impact players. But if you're not giving them too much, you have to either surround them with quality veterans or give them enough runway so that you turn those young players into veterans themselves. And so the Canadiens, I think, are going towards option B. But you're right. It's not, I mean, apart from Panarin and Adam Fox, who are two significant pieces, I mean, the rest is certainly not unattainable. Mika Zibanejad, for the most part of his career, has been considered like a lower type of first line centerman, maybe like in the same slot as Nick Suzuki.
But an excellent player.
Yeah, for sure. Vincent Trocheck as replaced him probably this year as their number one center. He was not perceived as a number one center before. I mean, Carolina basically ditched him in order to make room for Jesper Kotkaniemi. So, so I mean, all in all, and you know, you mentioned how it took some time for Shesterkin to come into his own. You had written a piece, I remember many months ago, about how long it takes for goaltenders to to reach the NHL. I mean, it took him
Mm.
6 years between his draft and him becoming like a solid goalie in the NHL. So, I mean, the Canadiens might have that in their pipeline right now, but are they going to be willing to wait that long for one of their young goaltenders to pan out? That's something that remains to be seen.
Yeah, and I would mention one last thing on the Rangers is, you look at their core players, and this is actually similar to the Stars in the sense that, they're really built on later draft picks. Chris Kreider was the 19th overall pick. They picked JT Miller at 15th overall, obviously not there anymore. Brady Shea was 28th overall, obviously not there anymore. But still,
Keandre Miller was the number 22.
Keandre Miller was a 22. Hedl was 21. They've actually kind of struck out on their higher picks. Lias Anderson, number 7, Kravtsov, number 9, Kakko, number 2. But they've really been good. Braden Schneider at 19th overall. Cully, who you mentioned earlier, was at 60th. It's a key element here that, the Canadiens are still going to need to do and hope that what they've done already in that regard. It's not looking great for Meshar right now, but I think it's still early to know like what he's going to do. But I mean, Owen Beck, the guys who are picked in that range, need to kind of form that second layer of quality on a team. And New York has that, and frankly, Dallas has it. When we get to them, they have it at the top layer, so it's, and the guy who ran a lot of those drafts, Gordie Clark, is also on the Canadian staff. He's a pro scout, not an amateur scout anymore, but he's there, and Jeff Gordon's there. So we'll see how that pans out. But it is, to me, you can replicate it, but the Panarin and the Fox pieces are obviously difficult to see a path to where the Canadiens are going to be able to get those types of players. That level of quality. Panarin was a legitimate Hart Trophy candidate this year. I didn't have him on my ballot, but it was a very, very difficult decision to make. He's right there. And Fox is a perennial Norris candidate, and finding those is not necessarily easy. So that's the definite roadblock. Maybe one of the defensemen the Canadiens have could turn into a Fox type, Fox level quality of player.
Mm-hmm.
It's still too early to see that. It's possible. I don't know how likely it is, but it's possible. But
he's a top 5 defenseman in the league. I mean, everybody
easily.
Yeah. So I don't think any of the Canadiens prospects on defense will be a top 5 defenseman in the league. I doubt.
Yeah, that's fair, but I don't think when Adam Fox was drafted in the second round or whenever he was drafted, that people thought he was going to be a top 5 defenseman in the league either. I don't even know if when he got traded to New York that the Rangers expected he would be a top 5 defenseman in the league. So it's defensemen develop later. The Canadiens have what they have. I don't think it's likely, but it's not impossible. All right, Florida to me is difficult. It's tough because I find it more difficult. Just like the Barkov piece is so rare. Maybe like Slot's a winger. It's kind of hard to compare, but like that combination of size, skill, the impact that he has on the game is so far-reaching and allows Paul Maurice to do so many other things with his other lines. Just knowing that he has that sort of blanket. I don't want to call it shutdown, but it's just like this guy who can face any player and probably win you your matchup.
Yeah,
is a really rare piece and a really shrewd pick back then. I remember when Barkov was taken third, it was a bit of a surprise. I don't think people had him going quite that high that year. Not a shock, he was firmly in the top 5, top 6 discussion, but it's that's a tough one. But I think you look at and obviously the Tkachuk trade is also hard to replicate because, frankly, we haven't seen it. I mean, the last time we saw anything close to similar to that was, I think, Seth Jones for Ryan Johansson back in the day. Can you think of another similar type of trade?
No, but there's something. There's something of the Adam Fox in the sense that the guy basically orchestrated where he wanted to go. You know, it's different circumstances because it's a guy who was a year away from free agency and there was pressure on the Calgary Flames to trade him, and I understand all that. But the fact of the matter is, in both cases, those were considered attractive destinations, and this is where Tkachuk wanted to go. And the Flames,
but the Panthers had to have someone like Huberdeau and Weegar be expendable. Like that's the tough part, you know. Like Huberdeau was one of the top scoring wingers in the league that year. Obviously, Calgary, I guess, underestimated the impact of his environment on his production. It hasn't worked out in Calgary, but still, that was a super high quality piece that they traded, plus another super high quality piece that they traded to get him. So it's, yes, he orchestrated his way there, but Calgary didn't have to trade him there. I mean, the pieces had to be there for that trade to work, you know, and I don't know the extent to which, I mean, the extent to like Huberdeau was another super high draft pick. Weegar is a guy that they, you know, that they developed into that, and that's full credit on them. But it's, I just see, you know, they have a number 1 overall pick in Ekblad on defense, which is, you know, he's turned into probably something similar to what the Canadiens hope Reinbacher turns into. Like, I mean, he's not necessarily a number 1 overall impact on that team, but still a solid defense with some shrewd decisions. You know, picking up Forsling for nothing, shrewd decision. But built a solid defense core and solid depth up front that I find, unless Doc at his highest possible ceiling, I'm not saying he'd become a player like Barkov, but could become a player that has a similar type of impact. Maybe it's tough to see that at this point, but it's a stretch. But
yeah, but Barkov's the heir apparent to Patrice Bergeron when it comes to the Selke conversation.
I know. I'm not saying the same type of player. I'm just saying the same type of impact, which means like it's that he's a play driving center that plays in the offensive zone more often than not, can play against difficult opponents. I'm not even saying that he's going to become that, but I mean, it's in a hypothetical, you know, the Canadiens have high hopes for him. If he's able to stay healthy, maybe become a player like that. And if he does, that's a game changer for what the Canadiens, and not even if he becomes that, if he becomes something that's even remotely similar to that, like even close to it, the entire Canadiens build changes drastically. But it's going to take some time to develop. And also the other thing the Panthers have done well, and I think the Canadiens are cognizant of this and that they're looking at it, like, you know, Nick Cousins, Lomborg, Bennett, obviously Tkachuk being who he is, but I mean, just this nasty nature of their depth guys, is, I think, a direction the Canadiens are going to look seriously at, because you see the impact it has on the playoffs. Brad Marchand talking about how he has no ill will towards Sam Bennett because everyone's trying to hurt everyone else, and so kudos to him for hurting him. You know, I think when Ken Hughes mentioned the desire to be a more physical team, and whether they can do that internally or not, that's been a consideration. I think the way the Panthers have used that in the playoffs last year, and they're proving it again this year.
Well, as a roster building comparison to the Canadiens, they're clearly not as comparable to the Canadiens as the Rangers are, because I mean, Bill Zito did an amazing job in making trades to assemble that team. There's two things. There are the trades and there's the style of play. First is the trades. If you look at the number of high draft picks that are now on this team, it's astounding because you got Barkov, who's an in-house draft pick, number 3 overall. They traded for Kachuk, number 6 overall. They traded for Sam Bennett, who was a number 4 overall. They traded for Verhage. He's not a high draft pick, though. They traded for Sam Reinhart, former number 2 overall. They traded for Oliver Ekman-Larsson, who did a great job at the beginning of the season when Montreal.
They signed him. They signed him as a free agent after he got bought out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
6th, exactly. He's a former number 6 overall. So those are a lot of former high picks, and that really stands out in a way that you don't see that in the same amount either on the Rangers or maybe among the veterans in Dallas. But this is something that has defined them. It's not a team that's defined by how they drafted and developed. They've got some homegrown players, but that identity it's through moves to create that group, that nucleus, who's now really have come to maturity. And the second thing is the style of play. Remember when Paul Maurice took over? I mean, under Andrew Brunette, it was still a very open, offensive type of team. And he brought a defensive structure that made it so that instead of being like a run and gun type, they really tightened things up defensively and went in the span of 2 years from a team that was leaking quality chances to the opponent to one of the tighter teams in the league. So when you have that firepower, that nastiness you were talking about, and you have a defensive structure that enables you to limit the other team's chances, you've got it all. So that's why it's no surprise that they're in the running again and they're on the top 4 teams remaining. But this is, in terms of roster construction, though, I don't see any similarity with what the Canadiens can hope to accomplish, though.
No, I mean, to your point, like, I think there's only 3 guys that they drafted that are pretty much.
There's Lundell.
There's Lundell, there's Barkov, and there's Ekblad, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah. Everyone
else was either signed or traded for. So it's, you're right. It's not. I think the Canadiens hope that they don't have to go down this path. That the players that they did draft will form kind of similar to the Rangers. Will form the nucleus. Now moving over to the Western Conference, I don't think we need to spend much time talking about Edmonton, just because that is not a relevant team building strategy to what the Canadiens are trying to do. There's nothing in common between Edmonton and Montreal. The only thing being that, I mean, Edmonton really did address its depth. The fact that they played, they finished the series without Adam Henrique, which is their big deadline acquisition that was supposed to help that. But I mean, they had Dylan Holloway emerge, played a pretty good series. He's been pretty good in the playoffs. And just, for other depth guys that really kind of shored up their non-McDavid and non-Draisaitl minutes. But again, it's McDavid, Draisaitl. That's the Oilers. there's no real comparison to be made there. The Canadiens don't have a path to getting a player like that unless nothing. There's actually no path to it. So we don't have to spend that much time on the Oilers. I don't think it's definitely, but the team that they eliminated, like this is what's, Vancouver is a projectable sort of model for the Canadiens to follow and look at. And the fact that they pushed Edmonton to 7 lends some credence to the notion that if you build a team like that, which I think is within the Canadiens' grasp, that could have some modicum of playoff success if you consider pushing a Stanley Cup contender to a 7th game in the second round to be success, which I think you should if you're the Canucks. Question being, is there enough there to get to that next level, or is this kind of their ceiling? And which I think is is a valid question and something that Canucks are going to have to address. There's a lot of players that are not locked in that they're going to have to sign. But that model of a team with just really effective role players and supplementing excellent, really good offensive players, but not necessarily elite top of class players. Although I guess you could argue Pettersson is in that group, but Pettersson didn't play that way in the playoffs. I think he himself would admit that. That's a model the Canadiens, and Quinn Hughes is, probably going to win the Norris Trophy. You can't just shove that aside, but I don't think Quinn Hughes was the same player in the playoffs for Vancouver either, which, I think when those two guys...
Quinn Hughes was on the ice during the regular season for 49.2 goals, 5-on-5 of the Canucks. That's a higher percentage than any defenseman in the league. And during the playoffs, until I think he finished equal with the least goals when he was on the ice for 5-on-5, with the least among the Canucks defensemen, which means that Carson Soucy would have more, Zadorov would have more. So his impact was clearly greatly reduced in the playoffs. I think that the comparison, the connection I make with the Canadiens here is behind the bench. To me, the way that Rick Tocchet has been able to take a roster that was trying to figure out his identity, understanding where they were going, and try to make something coherent of pieces that were a bit scattered all over the place and give them a direction. It reminds me of something that Martin St. Louis can do and is actually doing. You look at a guy like Connor Garland, who not so long ago wanted out of Vancouver, and you look at the way that he played in the playoffs. Yeah, you can say, well, you got to be big in order to play in the playoffs, but ultimately you have to have a level of compete that can be raised in the playoffs, no matter your size. And Connor Garland's that guy. Even though he's one of their smaller players, he's got that spunk in him. That's that Marchessault type of vibe. And he's but that's been bolstered by Rick Tocchet, who unleashed that in him and enabled him to do his thing. So I think that if you have a head coach that's able to understand, properly assess what you've got at your disposal and unleash the full potential of your players, that's a key. And in terms of culture too, look at the number of head coaches that have changed in the NHL in the last year. I mean, St. Louis now is like top 5 in terms of.
He's fifth.
He's
fifth or sixth.
So
just behind Tourigny. So
yeah, in terms of tenure behind the bench, that's totally insane. But everybody agrees that it's important to establish a good culture, but how can you expect to establish a good culture if you're changing your head coach constantly? So right now it's revolving doors. But Tocchet has been able to do that in Vancouver. I think that they understand who the Canucks are now, which was probably not the way it was a year and a half ago. And I think that in Montreal, except for maybe a couple of players who maybe are looking for their fit, that team, even though they're not great yet, they understand who they are, where they want to go, how they want to play. So that's the biggest correlation I see. The level of buy-in is on par for both instances.
That's it.
Yes.
And that's what Tocchet continuously references when talking about why the Canucks were able to turn it around so quickly. But yeah, in terms of, and there's similarities in the sense that they recently underwent a regime change. There's still some residue from the Jim Benning years. They have Oliver Ekman-Larsson's contract is on their cap for the foreseeable future. It's going to be a long time. And a significant cap hit at that coming up starting next year in 25-26. But so, the Canadiens have their residue from the Bergevin years still causing problems for them. Fascinating offseason in Vancouver because they have a lot of decisions to make and a lot of players, a lot of those, the depth guy like Bluger, Dakota, Joshua, Sam Lafferty, all unrestricted free agents. Zadorov, obviously, they picked up, but Myers, unrestricted free agent, who was a problem a year ago for this team, and we were actually talking about whether the Canadiens could acquire him in a sweetener just to take that contract off their hands, turn into
like the Sean Monahan deal.
Like the Sean Monahan deal, but he turned into a very important player for them, and probably has a good chance of signing a decent contract after how he performed in the playoffs. And obviously Philip Hronek, who also had a disappointing playoffs, but he's an RFA. They invested a lot in him. So, but generally speaking, there is, and we spent two entire episodes, I think, talking about how the Canadiens can replicate what the Canucks did. So it's interesting to see how close they came to being a Final Four team.
So now that we know that the Oilers are the team that has passed, and that the Canucks did not make it, we know that the Canadiens will be drafting 26th with what was originally the Winnipeg Jets pick. So we'll get to that in a minute, but let's just finish off with the fourth team in the conference finals, and that's the Dallas Stars. Interesting team, Arpin, because they are, to me, a team that's a lot more inspiring and compelling when you look at teams that could potentially be good examples for the Montreal Canadiens in terms of roster building and potentially a winning team without necessarily having a ton of high draft picks. I mean, they've drafted so well late in the first round, early in the second round, and they've created a very balanced lineup. So this to me is a team that's a lot more. I'm a lot more enthusiastic when I look at the Dallas Stars play and say, maybe this is a way that the Canadiens could follow. A lot more than the St. Louis Blues when they won the Cup in 2019, and it looked like a fluke. It looked like a team that was more of an outlier than anything, and a life jacket thrown to all those teams out there that were hoping for a chance somewhere to win the Stanley Cup. If once you get in, anything's possible. Well, they were an outlier, and when you look at the Dallas Stars, they don't look like an outlier. They don't look like an anomaly.
No, not at all. And it's just such a, when the Canadiens talk about building sustainable success, I think the Stars are doing that. They're in the conference final for the second year in a row. They are obviously in the final in the bubble playoffs, with a similar core, not the same. And they're built around Miro Heiskanen, who's the only real high pick on their team that they made. Tyler Seguin was a high pick, but he's the piece around which this team has been built. And the defense in general is what I feel drives that team. Yes, they have talent up front, but it's really depth-based talent. They come at you in waves. It's a lot of good to very good to excellent players without having that elite offensive talent that Edmonton has, that New York has, that Florida has. They're a group their team that's built on defense, much like I think the Canadiens hope to build their team, and they have to hope to some extent that David Reinbacher, number 5 pick last year, turns into some version of Miro Heiskanen for them, that be sort of the leader of a group that is similar in age, at least the key pieces, supplemented with a veteran guy or two, but really you look at, Heiskanen and Harley on the top pair, drafted in consecutive years.
Yeah.
It's a group that's the focal point of their success. And that's what the Canadiens hope to build on their defense, while building a forward group that might not be led by a McKinnon or a McDavid or a Panarin, but that is better than the sum of its parts, in the sense that as a group, will be difficult to handle defensively. And so, of all the teams, the Stars are what look like the most replicable team for the Canadiens, and their success, if they're able to get past Edmonton, and this is really a referendum on this kind of debate, because up until now, the belief was, and it's justifiable, but based on looking at past Stanley Cup champions, that you need that top offensive talent up front that drives the bus for you. There's very few cases of teams winning without that. The Stars could be that, and they could do it in a way, as you mentioned, that would not be a fluke, but that would be a purposeful build. But the important thing to point out with the Stars, and we mentioned it with the Rangers, is just the success they had drafting players later in the draft. It's something that they have excelled at. Going back to obviously the 2017 draft that really set the stage for this. Heiskanen at 3, obviously, but Ottinger at 26, Robertson at 39. Their first 3 picks are all key contributors. Rope Hintz, 49th pick in 2015. I'd said Harley and Heiskanen were in consecutive years. They weren't, actually. Harley was in 2019, but he was the 18th pick in that draft. Wyatt Johnson, 23rd overall. Logan Stankoven, 47th overall. So this is, we're not going to know the answer to this for the Canadiens for another couple of years, but this is what the Stars are really built on. Yes, they have a strong defense. Yes, they've invested a lot, and it's a good group, but supplementing their group with these hits later in the draft have really allowed them to build the group that they have. And
in the meantime, the fact that they had so many effective players, young players coming in that were drafted late in the first or early in the second, is also, it's what enabled them, even from a salary cap perspective, that it's made the Seguin contract and the Jamie Benn contract more palatable as they were transitioning from the former pillars of that team to guys that not necessarily are support, but certainly don't have the same sort of pressure to be like the locomotives of that team that they had probably 5 years ago. When they Seguin got into all sorts of injuries and he's not the same player as he once was. But it made, they went through the years of being like very tight against the salary cap, but they were able to do that transition, and really it turned out to be like a rebuild on the fly just because of all those hits in the draft. But you add so many guys that are on entry-level contracts that are effective, or even their second contract, and they don't necessarily have to earn like 7 or 8 millions right on their second deal. But I mean, when you have the luxury of having a guy like Wyatt Johnston who has such an impact early on, it changed the face of your team too. It's because now he's got he's closing in on 200 games played if you go both regular season and playoffs. So he's got more than his feet wet, but now he's become a top line player for them, a real difference maker, and he's able to be a difference maker at a young age instead. So that's where it's different than with the Rangers, because the Rangers have a lot of those veterans that are driving the bus. But up front for the Stars, the younger players are also making it, probably playing a more prominent role. So I just find that their balance is just outstanding.
Yeah, exactly. And it is, you mentioned strong link and weak link before. Not to say that this is a weak link team. They have excellent players.
Yeah.
But it is more of a depth-based model that and defense-heavy model that that the Canadiens could aspire to in a realistic way. There's and we don't have to go player by player, but just as a team building philosophy, and I think there are some cases where the Canadiens could learn something, like, Logan Stankoven. You look at him and you'd be like, well, there's a reason why he got to the second round of the draft, is that he's not the biggest guy in the world. In fact, he's quite small. Hasn't been dominant in the playoffs, but still contributing player in the playoffs. Wyatt Johnston is not the biggest guy in the world, but he's performing excellent, and so,
they're the biggest team apart from Stankoven, who's 5'8". They're the biggest team in the playoffs. For sure among the 4 teams remaining, but you'd be hard pressed to find another team that had so many, big forwards that were north of 6'2". It's clearly like it's almost a throwback in the way that how we used to perceive the Western Conference teams back in the day when the Thornton Marlowe years in San Jose, and the old Dallas teams too. That's a big team. So it plays a factor also, and they're fully invested in the belief that if you want to survive and thrive in the playoffs, you need bigger guys. So it's not everybody, it's not every team who's been following that path, but the Dallas Stars seem committed to that.
Yeah. I guess they are bigger than I thought they were, but it's true. And the Canadiens are committed to that as well. That's definitely something that they believe. So I didn't realize Wyatt Johnston was 6'2". I just looked at it. So anyhow, but so speaking of Wyatt Johnston, actually, and this is a good segue to talking about that 26th pick. So Wyatt Johnston was acquired or was drafted in a year when the Detroit Red Wings were desperate to get up from the 22nd pick to 14th to draft Sebastian Cossa, who was a big goaltender. He played for the Edmonton Oil Kings in the WHL. That was in 2021. So in exchange for the number 14 pick, the Stars received the 22nd pick, the 47th pick, and the 137th pick, 5th rounder, to allow the Red Wings to move up from 22 to 14. That 22nd pick turned into Wyatt Johnston. That 47th pick turned into Artem Grushnikov, who the Stars used to acquire Chris Tanev at the deadline. And the 5th round pick didn't amount to much, but still, very impactful trade by trading down, and leads us to that 26th pick of the Jets, which primarily you would think the Canadiens are going to use in some sort of trade. Now, we'll get to the possibilities of what they might do if they don't trade it, but we had a lot of questions in the mailbag. We've had a lot of questions in general lately from you guys asking how the Canadiens can use that pick to move into a position where they could potentially pick a higher impact type of player. I got bad news for you. It's not very likely that it's going to happen. Now, it could happen if the Canadiens were to package that pick with a player on their roster or in their system that interests a team, a player or two. But looking purely at picks over the last 5 or 6 years that were used to move up, the most relevant trade happened in 2022. The San Jose Sharks had the number 11 pick that year. The Arizona Coyotes traded them the number 27 pick, 34, and 45, so 2 more second rounders to get from 27 to 11. That 34 and 45 is something the Canadiens don't have. So you could argue that if you add one of their defensemen, or maybe even 2, you can replicate that type of value, but that's what it costs to get from 27 to 11 in 2022. Aside from that, I just mentioned the Red Wings going from 22 to 14, so that cost them a 2nd and a 5th. That was in 2021. In 2021, the Wild traded down from 19 to 21 and got the 89th pick from the Oilers to do so. There's very few examples, but it's generally costly. In 2019, the Coyotes again traded up from 14 to 11 with the Flyers and had to give up number 45 to just move up 3 spots. Moving up 4 spots for the Rangers in 2018 cost them the 48th pick. They moved from 26 to 22. 48th pick is something the Canadiens don't really have right now. They do have the Avalanche second round pick, which will obviously be a bit later in the second round. So looking at the recent history, the Canadiens, based solely on their draft capital in this draft, don't really have the ammunition to do it. Now, they do have 2 first round picks next year. And so they could, in theory, use one of those picks, whether they're comfortable using their own or the Flames pick in the first round next year, package that with the 26th pick, and then maybe you can really make some headway and get up into the teens. But it's costly. Is I guess the whole point of this exercise is that it does cost a lot to move up that much.
But why would Montreal do that anyway? What's the point in trying to improve your, like, using some of your ammunition, your trade chips, to go from 26 and improve your draft rank and go in the teens, let's say? Is it because you have a chance that Beckett Seneca is still going to be there? Is it because you have a chance of drafting Cole Eiserman in the mid-teens? Because there might be a good defenseman still? I just don't get it. I don't think that the Canadiens are there anymore, and trying to find ways to add some more draft guys, especially if it's not at the top of the board. If you were telling me the Canadiens are they could use the 26th pick in order to go from 5 to 4, it's probably what it would cost them, because the guy that they wanted is still there. Maybe. Yeah. But I would say that if the Canadiens choose to move the 26th pick, it will be in a hockey deal. It would be in an actual trade, not to trade up and from an abstract trade up of draft picks in order that they reposition themselves better in the draft. I don't see that.
Well, I think first of all, I mean, I don't think Seneca is going to make it to 13, 14, whatever it would be. But if he does, I think that would be a reason to do it. I mean, it's if he's still around, mm-hmm. But yeah, it would take a specific set of circumstances, and I think people kind of, a lot of the questions that we got in the mailbag, at least, they're like, listen, we could add potentially 2 top 6 forwards in this draft if it plays out right, and the Cole Eiserman example, I think he's likely to be available in that range. Depending on how the Canadiens view that, it could be something. But yeah, it's one of numerous options that they have with that pick. And I do think what you mentioned is using it in a hockey trade is the most likely scenario. So, and based on the last 2 years, especially last year, I mean, that's what they did, right? So it's just, I'm just saying that it only reinforces your point. Like, not only do they not have a huge reason to do it, they don't really have the proper ammunition to do it either. So it doesn't make sense from that point of view as well.
Yeah. So it's about finding the best use for that 26th pick. And I'm sure that in the weeks prior to the draft, the work must have already started, and there must be, phone calls that have been made and fillers sent out to gauge the interest and the value of that pick. Some teams might have forwards available and they're short on draft picks, and they'd be open to have another guy in the first round, albeit it's like further down the board. But if the Canadiens want to dangle that pick and do a hockey trade, I think it would be their first option. And if nothing's confirmed or nothing's done before the draft, then they could use it differently. You're talking about using it to trade up. There's not much room to trade up. in the draft from 5. That first round pick won't get you from 5 to 2. Probably won't get you from 5 to 3, but it could enable you to get from 5 to 4. But that means that the Columbus Blue Jackets would not want the same player as the Canadiens would seek at number 4, and for that reason, Columbus would say, you know what, we'll get that extra pick and we'll get our guy at 5. So that's the only situation where I see a trade.
In which case, the Canadiens might be like, oh, they're willing to do this trade. Well, let's not do it because they're probably not going to take our guy.
That's it.
Yeah.
So basically, if there is a fit, it's because it's not worth doing it, and you just stand pat and you wait for your pick. So there's a lot of intel that'll need to be done on that part. So I don't. Although last year, I mean, it was clear that at number 4, Will Smith would be the guy, right?
Yeah.
And the Canadiens still made some attempts to go from 5 to 4 in order to secure Will Smith, and then after the top 4, Reinbacher was their next best option past that top 4. So it didn't work, but I could see a similar situation happening this year if for some reason Demidov is not taken in the top 3. So then they would have to dispute with Columbus for that pick. So, but I think that there's a possibility also that they just might hold on to it and draft someone.
Yeah, there's a possibility, and it's for sure, because there's a lot more moving parts this year for the Canadiens than in past years. You know, the situation on defense being as crowded as it is definitely a desire on the Canadiens' part to kind of monetize some of that depth. The extent to which they could do that, you know, kind of depends on what you consider the value of some of these guys to be. Like, does Justin Barron have much trade value? Does Jordan Harris have much trade value? Does Jaden Struble have much trade value? I mean, it's that group. You know, what can they actually get you? And I think they're about to find out. They're going to try. I think there's going to be discussions involving a wide range of defense, both prospects and players. But that 26th pick, along with one or even two of the guys that I mentioned, now you're talking some pretty decent value for another team looking to make a trade. So, but in terms of guys that might be available there, I mean, there are some guys that might legitimately interest the Canadiens that could be around at that spot. Really unpredictable draft, and it's widely considered to have pretty significant drop after the top 15 or so. But still, some guys that could be worth taking a chance on, adding to their pipeline up front. A few guys that I'm curious about. I don't think any of these. Well, I don't think the first two guys I mentioned will be available at 26. But Cole Baudouin out of Barrie, big guy, fitness freak, has just kind of a motor that doesn't stop. He's very strong, fits kind of the playoff style, physical forward profile the Canadiens are looking for. And Sacha Boisvert, local product, plays in the USHL, and Muskegon going to North Dakota next year. Another bigger guy who can play and who will probably be gone by 26, but would obviously check a couple of extra boxes for this organization, being a local kid. Are two that kind of come to mind for me as possibilities of being there at 26. Now, can you bank on either of them being there? Probably not, because they're probably not going to be there, but they're two guys that kind of jump out.
Yeah, Baudouin has a chance to be there at 26.
He has a chance, but I'm saying you can't. He's a chance he'll be gone too. Is all I'm saying. Like, it's not a sure thing. You know, the sure things are guys that are kind of projected to be later. But I think those are two guys that I think the Canadiens would probably jump on if they could with that pick.
Yeah. You saw back when they were with the Rangers, Gorton and Barbroff drafted Keandre Miller at 22. And there's potentially a guy that's drawn parallels to Keandre Miller, and his name is E.J. Emery. E.J.
Yeah.
Emery. Um,
Another
I'm not.
fitness, another physical freak of nature.
Yeah,
Like, I mean, just in terms
absolutely.
of his conditioning and his muscle and everything. Yeah.
Yeah. So tall, right-handed shot defenseman who maybe has not shown a lot of offensive just yet, but and neither had Miller back then. But it could. There's comparisons that are drawn between the two guys. I think that if the Canadiens draft a forward, with the number 5 pick, I think that there's a chance there, like in that second wave of defensemen after, like you've got the top 6 defensemen that are clearly established in everybody's minds, but after that, there's a
Mm.
second slate of defensemen there where there might be someone of interest for Montreal, especially if he's a righty. So Emery, for me, could be an interesting option at 26. And there's this guy, this Russian kid, Yegor Surin, who's
Yes.
meant to be like this crazy crazy guy who hits everything he sees. He's also creative centerman. Has been
Mm.
playing in the MHL this season, and he provides an interesting ingredient to your recipe. Something that
Mm.
that's probably not many players can provide. So if he manages, if he's considered to be having enough offense to be translatable in the North American game, and he's also, if the scouts believe that he's a guy who can show enough responsibility to not put his team in trouble too often, he could certainly be an interesting spark to get late in the draft. So late in the first round. So Surin, Boisvert, Baudouin, Emery, those are 4 between those 4, there should be one that'd be still available at 26, but they're totally different players. All of
Yeah.
them are like 4, it's like opening 4 different doors, even between Baudouin and Boisvert, because Baudouin is more a defensive first, I guess, type of
Yeah.
centerman, whereas Boisvert,
Kind of a third line center
yeah,
profile. Yeah.
exactly. Whereas Boisvert, shoot first mentality,
Mm.
centerman. I don't. I wonder if he won't be moved to the wing at some point in the pros. We'll
Yeah.
see. But he's a bigger guy too. So it's anyway. Those are interesting profiles. But
Well,
um,
one thing on Surin too to add is that as reported earlier, the Canadiens did get into Russia a couple of times this year to look at Demidov in the MHL, and so they would presumably at the same time have been able to see him live playing in the MHL. So that's another kind of factor to consider there. And
yeah,
yeah, he's got a tantalizing profile, but the fact that not every team did get into Russia, in fact, few teams probably did, um, might slip as a result.
yeah,
Whereas he would otherwise, like several Russia players over the last couple of years have done, would otherwise have been taken higher. So that's a possibility as well.
yeah. So before we wrap up that portion, so you mentioned that if the Canadiens were to combine one of their like 2 of their overflow of young defensemen and their 26 pick, they could get somebody interesting. Um, I want to go back to Martin Necas because there's something interesting that happened on the heels of the Hurricanes being eliminated. Is that there are like renewed reports, including an interview that his father gave in Czechia, uh, pertaining to the fact that Necas would seek a trade and would hope
Mm-hmm.
to sign his next deal uh, with another organization. He's still 2 years away from free agency, so he's 25. Um, do you? There's no doubt that there's going to be demands for that guy. I mean, there's at times I thought that his playoff performances were not super convincing, but there were other games where he was literally flying in there and found some chemistry later in the playoffs with Jordan Martinook there. But he's a
Mm-hmm.
guy who can play both circles on the power play. He's finally decided to shoot more this year, and he's got a great one timer. Um, I mean, he can carry the puck in, even though now he's I think it's well established that he's going to be a right winger and not a centerman, but he can carry the puck in, do some good give and go. He can drive the net. There's a lot to like in that guy, but I
Mhm.
wonder if the Canadiens can manage to build a package that's going to be interesting enough, uh, to beat the other offers that the Carolina Hurricanes might receive. That's one. That's part one, and part two is, according to Evolving Hockey, the projection on a 7-year deal for Necas would be roughly $7.5 million a year.
Mhm.
Would you be willing to give that sort of money for a guy that reached 70 points only once in his career, and he's in his mid-20s now?
Well, I think one thing that the Canadians look at, they did with Newhook for sure, is how the role on your role on the team impacts your production, and the fact that he made it to 70 points while playing kind of a secondary role on the Hurricane. I think this is, well, at least according to his dad, this is one of the reasons why he wants to trade, is that he doesn't see a future top six role for himself in Carolina with the players that are there in place right now. And so,
Mm-hmm.
I think his production the last 2 years, 28 goals last year, 24 goals this year, pretty healthy scoring numbers. Um, you know, does that mean they would want to give him that kind of a contract? He's coming off a bridge, so that's how he's different from Newhook and Doc, is that you're not signing him out of entry level. You're signing him off a bridge, so he's not going to be willing to do another pseudo bridge again. That'd be a big commitment on their part, but there's no denying that he would slide in quite nicely among the top six forwards on the Canadiens. It's just that he would do so in many other places. I mean, the first thing I think of when I see his profile and what he's done, the first team I think of is the Ducks. With Verbeek saying we want to add a top six
Yeah.
right shot forward. Well, there's Marty Necas just sitting there, and do the Ducks have more ammunition to make a trade happen with the Hurricanes? Maybe. I mean, they have a pretty decent pipeline themselves. They have a decent kind of war chest of draft picks. That could be a possibility. But I do think that the Hurricanes, and we've mentioned it, but it bears repeating, that the overflow of defense on Montreal, while not super attractive on an individual basis, but like having two of those young defensemen would be cheaper to plug in, that they know they can plug into their defense right now based on how they've already performed in the NHL, would have some value to a team like Carolina, whose defense is perhaps going to be turned upside down.
It's going to be decimated.
It's going to be, well, Brett Pesce's basically gone.
Yeah.
Brady Shea sounds like he's basically gone. Jalen Chatfield. Well, I mean, it's going to be, listen, it's going to be tricky. I mean, you have Shea, Pesce, Chatfield, all UFA.
Yeah.
Orlov and Slavin are a year away from UFA. Elliot Friedman was mentioning the other day on 32 Thoughts how he thinks that the Hurricanes are going to sign Slavin to an extension as soon as they're allowed to this summer, which would go into the calculation of how much they can spend on the rest of their defense. Orlov's a year away from UFA. Burns is a year away from UFA. You have Teravainen, Gensel, Necas, Seth Jarvis, all these contracts that are coming up that they need to figure out. So having, let's say, two guys that they could comfortably plug in to their D right now at a relatively cheap price that won't be expensive for the foreseeable future or in the next few years would have some value to this team, I think.
Yeah.
So that's the one thing the Canadiens have, plus the 26th pick. So the two things the Canadiens have, and the Hurricanes are drafting, I believe, 27th, if I'm not mistaken. So that would give them two picks in a row at that range, which is maybe they could use to move up a little bit. But as we just mentioned, it's not always easy, but it's easier with 26 and 27 than it is with 26 and 50, whatever, wherever the Avalanche pick is. So that combined with the need to add some cheap defensemen to allow them to do some of the other things they want to do, could make for a match. But yeah, there's definitely, if Nate just finds himself on the market, it's going to be there's going to be competition for sure. There's no doubt.
Do you think that the Canadiens have anybody to offer up front?
Sure, they got guys to offer, whether Carolina wants them or not.
No. But I mean that are, of course.
Yeah,
I'm talking about dead weight, but I'm talking about somebody who could be legitimately interesting. Because if I'm the Carolina Hurricanes and my window's open, I want to go. I want to be able to turn Netchus into guys that are cheaper, but that are keeping me competitive.
well, one guy, and don't laugh, but I mean, I've spoken to more than one professional scout about this. One guy who would fit really well in the way Carolina plays under Rod Brind'Amour is Josh Anderson, for sure. Like a straightforward, straight line, forechecking style. Mm-hmm. That's really they're up front about it. That's the way they play, and he would fit in that kind of a system, or that kind of a play style. So these contracts is still an issue. It's not as if they'd be dying to add, but if he were to get back, and I think the Canadiens have to consider the possibility that Josh Anderson is an excellent bounce back candidate. Like if I'm Josh Anderson, it would be easy in my mind to say I have more of a sample of being a good NHL forward than I do of a bad one. And if you look at how he bounced back after that injury-plagued year in Columbus, he has a history of being able to put a bad season behind him. But it's you look at the way Carolina plays, and Josh Anderson would fit that really well.
Yeah. Well, you see, we talked about the Dallas Stars are a big team, right? And it's significant in the playoffs how they're a big team, and the Carolina Hurricanes have a lot of smaller forwards, and maybe that they're thinking of something that a way to change the mix a little bit over there, because I mean, Seth Jarvis is not going anywhere, but he's not the biggest guy. He's got a huge heart, but he's not the biggest guy. Mm-hmm. They're probably going to replace some of the guys that are leaving with some of their homegrown talent. But Bradley Nadeau, it's not necessarily a big guy either. He's 5'10", 178. Jackson Blake, that the guy. I think they signed him out of the NCAA. Again, another guy who's 5'10", 158 pounds.
Yeah. Well, they drafted him too, but it's
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was his third or fourth round pick, huh? Right? So
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, fourth round pick. So they need going to just playing along with what you were saying about Josh Anderson. At least he would bring something different in that mix. Mm-hmm. And it could be a reason why they say, well, if Teravainen wants to move also, and we're not ready to give him the money that he would seek, giving it to a bigger guy, a lesser amount, but a bigger guy who's got 2 or 3 years left on his deal, it would not be so silly.
No, and you look, Carolina's kind of made a habit of going after sort of market inefficiencies at the draft. So if a guy's a little bit smaller, that's why teams didn't pick him. Carolina tends to pick him. If a guy's Russian and that's why he's dropped, Carolina will tend to pick him. They are a team that sort of disregards some of the prevailing wisdom in terms of evaluating draft eligible players, and just goes after talent. And so, they don't have a ton of guys like that in their system. And so I don't know the extent to which they're also a highly analytically driven organization. Josh Anderson is not someone that a highly analytically driven organization would be all that enticed by. So there's that as well. But, I think play style, like what we said earlier about the Canadiens looking at role or circumstances or environment in evaluating a player, it's not unreasonable to think that Carolina would look at Josh Anderson and say, well, he doesn't do all that great there. But the way that Rod plays here, he could fit as a guy who skates fast, and he's big, and he hits people, and he can score goals. I don't think you'd be getting full value for Josh Anderson, but just the fact of taking that contract on would add value for Carolina as well, probably, because you're getting him. Yeah. You're going to get him at a discount of some way, either with Montreal throwing in a draft pick, whether that's number 26, it could be. I think I don't know how possible that is, but just purely from an outsider's view, he's definitely a guy who would fit there.
Yeah. All right, let's go. Let's move to the mailbag because we're running late and we've got many questions to answer. So here's your Monday mailbag.
We do a mailbag every Monday, you know.
Let's go to the mailbag. Let's go to the mailbag.
Mailbag.
You know, they reach out and they write to us.
All right.
They mailbag on a Tuesday, should I mention?
Yes.
So yeah. All right. Take it away, my friend.
All right, so let's go. We're going to go to where are we going to start? Let's start with Chris. Chris asks 3 questions. They're all based around the fact that he says, it's become clear now that one of the biggest factors in convincing the Habs to pick Slafkovsky was his character. By that, I mean his competitiveness, his willingness to learn, his ability to thrive under pressure. So, 3-part question from Chris based on that premise. Operating under the assumption that the Canadiens will draft one of Demidov, Lindstrom, Kattan, Iginla, or Seneca, which has demonstrated the most appealing character to the Habs. Question 2, do we overestimate or underestimate the notion of character as a key factor in the Canadian selection process? And number 3, which he considers the best of the 3, if you had to pick a single factor you believe this Canadiens administration will prioritize this year, which would it be? You cannot say a combination of many. So would it be character, fit within the lineup, play style, physical build, etc.? All right. Well, thank you for the question, Chris. As for question 1, out of those players that you mentioned, which has demonstrated the most appealing character to the Habs, I can't really answer that right now, but I think, if you consider competitiveness to be a part of character and just a well-roundedness to their game, I think that's a big reason why Seneca's climbed and is climbing, is just how he raised his game in the playoffs. His competitiveness, his size, his skill package as sort of a late growth spurt kind of guy. He has excellent puck skills, excellent hands in a growing kind of frame. But the way his game elevated in the playoffs, I think is impressive, not just to the Canadiens, but to many teams. I think they see somewhat similar traits in Demidov. I know that, the fact that he was playing in the MHL didn't discourage him or didn't lead him to think that he's wasting his time there, which if you watched any of Michkov's games last year in the MHL, that he really gave that vibe that he just didn't belong in that league. Well, Demidov probably didn't belong in that league, but he didn't play like it at all. So I think that is probably going to be appealing. Lindstrom's a bit of a wild card. I mean, Lindstrom, it really is the physical tools, the skills. He wasn't in a position to show that character. However, I will say that my colleague Scott Wheeler has a very interesting piece on Lindstrom that dropped this morning on The Athletic. And his coach and GM, Willie Desjardins and Mendelson I think, made a very good point. Well, Lindstrom wasn't 100% when he came back to play in the playoffs. And the point he made is that he could have very easily just said, I'm not going to play because it's not going to help. It might hurt his draft stock because he wasn't going to be able to perform at his best when in the most important games. So Desjardins considered it very commendable that he came back anyway, in spite of that risk, which ultimately turned out to be true, where he didn't look great in the playoffs, probably didn't help his draft stock, but he wanted to help the team in any way he could. So he considered that a form of character. And obviously, Iginla's playoffs were off the charts, so that would help. So I guess I could answer that question to some extent.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
question two, I'll bounce it to you though. Do we overestimate or underestimate the notion of character as a key factor in the Canadian selection process?
Uh, Neither. I don't. I think that people sometimes get annoyed by the idea of intangibles because this is not something that's necessarily assessed on the ice like quickly by everybody. Although character is to me has a lot to do with your level, your work rate, and how much do you show that you want it. Um, and to that extent, it could never be overestimated.
Hmm.
In a league where there's a lot of individual skill now, if you can show that you want it more than the other guy, that will hard work will always, in my view, in at key moments, hard work will trump skill. And we're seeing it again in the playoffs. We see it year after year. Um, there are some skilled plays that were done in this regular season that all of a sudden cannot be done in the playoffs. There's less rooms. It's battle for positioning in front of the net. And
You're facing quality opponents every night.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that the character is also to find ways to get to your goals and get to the goal. So it's not necessarily it's a criteria I think that cannot be neglected. And it's not just the Canadiens. I think that any team will be looking for that. Any team would be looking for, can you skate? Can you think the game well? And do you want it more than the next guy? So it's the compete level is just too important, because if you don't have it, you're not you won't be able to use your skill properly if you don't have the motivation or the engine inside to. You need to be programmed that way, and that's what scouts are seeking everywhere. Sometimes it's harder to define, it's harder to perceive. For other guys, it jumps out the page. And I think that for the Canadiens, they're definitely going to look at character and say as an important factor in their decision making, in their evaluation. So yeah, Slav, it was easy to see, and it continues to be easy to see, and that's what made the whole physical and skill package so enticing. It's because it was motivated and it was pushed by a desire that was too good to pass on.
Yeah. And so question three, if you had to pick a single factor you believe this administration will look at, well, I think we just touched on it. I think the one thing that we've learned from both the Slav and Reinbacher picks is that they look at an ability to excel in a particular environment, which I think speaks to character. In Slav's case, it was the fact that he performed at his best at the big events. The Olympics and the World Championships in his draft year, the World Championships prior to that at almost a record-breaking young age. In Reinbacher's case, it was really his ability to excel in a men's professional league with very little prior experience with competition at that level, and how he was able to perform there. So I think a player's environment and how they react to the ebbs and flows of pressures in a season and particular points in the season matter a lot to this group. So I know, Chris, you said you cannot say a combination of many, but I think there are several factors that go into that evaluation where a player's environment is taken into account. But character is probably the biggest one, but there's, hockey IQ is part of it. But to me, it seems like that really resonates with this group, is how is a player doing in situations where it would be okay for him to fail, but he succeeds regardless, and kind of overcomes some odds to succeed. I think that's personally, I think, a big factor for this group. I don't know if you have a different answer to that, but
yeah, I do actually. I think that because we're getting to know them and understand how they think. I think the single biggest factor for this group of scouts with Montreal is rarity. is how
Mm,
rare is that player or that player profile that is available for them as a prospect. They'll look as how rare is this player profile, and the rarer he is, the higher he'll be on the board.
right.
So I think that's a criteria because yeah, all the other dimensions, whether it's the skating, the hockey IQ, that they'll balance it out. But when you add to you had the physical frame, the position that the guy plays. I was mentioning Surin before, who had this sort of an X factor in his game. That's probably something that they'll think of and say, there's a rarity in the profile of that player. So I think that's something that seems particular, like to Bobroff. That, for example, Trevor Timmins it was not necessarily as high on his list of criteria than it might be for Bobroff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next one. We have a couple of guys, Irvin Shine and Eric Toth, both asked the same question. Let's take Irvin's then. I know you don't claim to be experts on this, but if David Reinbacher was eligible for the draft this year instead of last, where would you rank him relative to the other top defensemen? So Reinbacher obviously was the first defenseman drafted last year. He will not be the first this year. I think that Levshunov would be drafted before him. I think that Silayev would be drafted before him. And I think that probably Dickinson would be drafted before him, but I would probably put him fourth. I'm sure that after that, like, Parik is a guy with great offensive upside, but I'm sure that there's not going to be a consensus around the how translatable all of his offensive skills are, considering his smaller build for a defenseman. And there's been such a backlash following the Reinbacher's pick last year that we tend to forget that other teams were in on him. And, Arizona would have drafted him at number 6 had Montreal not drafted it at 5. So it's not, the Canadiens did not made that selection out of the blue and were alone on that. There was an understanding among many teams, and Philadelphia too was interested in Reinbacher. So there was a case to be made that he was seen as the best defenseman in that draft class. So you put him in this case here, you might have a lot of different answers as to who is the top defenseman. Maybe that there would be some teams who would put Parik or Bouillon ahead of Reinbacher, but I feel like if he was maybe around 4th or 5th on that list this year, that sounds about right for me. How about you?
I would put him third. I think I'd put him ahead of Dickinson just because of the right shot rarity thing, and that's why he both Levshunov is a right shot. Silayev has spent all year playing basically on the right side as a left shot, and obviously has the size component that's really unique for him.
Yeah.
So I think I would probably put him third this year, ahead of Dickinson, just for that reason. Not to take anything away from. I think Dickinson's a tremendous defense prospect and really, really impressive. But I would put him third. But I don't have a big issue with you putting him fourth.
Okay.
But it does. The one question this begs is: would the Canadiens have been better off taking Ryan Leonard with that pick last year? Not even Michkov, even though I'm sure a lot of people think they should have taken Michkov. But let's forget the Michkov thing, because the Canadiens were clearly had issues with him. They did not have issues with Ryan Leonard, and Ryan Leonard is so. Would they have been better off taking Ryan Leonard and having this exact same pick in a year with a lot more defense options than doing it the other way around, where they took the best defenseman in the draft in a weak draft year for defensemen, and are now going to try and pick up a forward in a year where defensemen are the more dominant group among the prospects. I think there's an argument to be made that they would be better off, that they would have been in a better spot had they taken sort of the unique package that Ryan Leonard brings, the exact type of playoff style player the Canadiens covet, and been able to add a Silayev or a Dickinson, or probably not Levshunov at number 5, maybe not even Silayev, but had a chance to add a player of that caliber. But again, if Levshunov and Silayev are gone by 5, and if you think Reinbacher's close to them, then you're maybe getting a lesser defenseman out of it, and probably not a right shot if you don't take Parik. Unless they're big on Yakemchuk, which I don't know. Maybe they are, but I think I think that argument can be made that maybe they should have gone after the forward last year and the defenseman this year, as opposed to doing it the other way around.
Well, yeah, if Levshunov as the best right-handed defenseman, possibly the best defenseman available at this draft class, was available at 5, then it becomes a no-brainer. You say you have Ryan Leonard last year, Levshunov this year. That's a good combo. Now it might be Reinbacher and Lindstrom, maybe.
Yeah,
it's not too bad either. It's almost, I'd give the edge on defense, but up front, with the size and the value on the position also that Lindstrom plays, it's not so obvious to me. And the fact is, Levshunov would not be there at 5 anyway. So then, if the insistence was to draft a right-handed shot, such as they did last year, then you have to compromise on the type of defenseman that you're going to draft if you're absolutely looking this year for a right-hand shot D.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that's fair. Okay, let's get one or two more in if we can. Well, here's one that I think we could maybe quickly. This comes from Chuck, who's in Toronto, but he was born and raised in Newfoundland. And I really love how many people send notes that they're linked to Newfoundland ever since we answered those 2 questions from guys from Portugal Cove. Portugal Cove, is that right?
Yeah.
Portugal Cove, Newfoundland. Anyone who's from Newfoundland who sends in an email always makes a point to mention that they're from Newfoundland to try and get on the show. So it worked, Chuck, even though you're in Toronto. Let's see, a couple of weeks ago, you were discussing the possibility of Cole Perfetti being a fit. Marc-Antoine mentioned in passing that he heard Ehlers could be available this summer. Now there's a guy, myself and my friend have been throwing around all season as someone we'd love to see Hughes take a run at for top 6 scoring. He might be slightly older than the Habs core, solid possession numbers this year with reduced ice time, UFA in 2025, reasonable cap hit. So he'll have his fair share of suitors, especially now after Murat Atesh confirmed this week that he is indeed on the block. Could you see the Habs taking a hard look at Ehlers this offseason?
I don't.
I don't either.
I don't. I think Ehlers is a very crafty, talented forward who seems like he was on the edge of stardom and he's sort of missed the boat. He spent a lot of time on the injured list over the years. I think that's a factor. But when he was healthy, the fact that he has never been able to entrench himself solidly on the top line in Winnipeg, it leaves me wonder, why was he always the one who was sacrificed on the altar of depth and spreading the goods in Winnipeg? And he was never part of, say, let's make like a solid top line. They got Connor, obviously, who was their best winger and his top flight scorer. That's fine. But I think that he's a guy who, we talked about size in the playoffs and also where skill, for all the skill that you can see throughout the regular season, is it going to shine always in the playoffs? He's not a guy who's been very effective in the playoffs. I mean, he's got something like I don't have the stats in front of me, but I think
14 points in 37 career playoff games.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
So that's four goals, right?
Four goals.
It's not great. It's not great for a guy who's. If you're looking at him to be a difference maker, that's not it. And he's not a big build either.
He has 457 points in 605 regular season games. So that's like a drastic difference in scoring rate from regular season to playoffs.
Yeah. And so if the guy's older and you choose to invest and spend assets on that guy and spend money, he's got to be able to help you when this team's going to be good. No. I understand. He's a good player. He's fun to watch, and I recognize in games I've seen from the Jets, yes, here's a good player, but doesn't quite fit what the Canadiens, I think, should be looking for. And if he's the one that's to be like made available by the Jets, to me, it raises the question: why him? Why wouldn't they use somebody else's trade bait?
Yeah, and why would the Canadiens go after a guy who's a year away from UFA? And it just doesn't. It doesn't. There's a lot of reasons why it doesn't make sense. Like it's just like it's so. But yeah, good player for sure.
Okay, I've got one here that's very very quick one. Do you guys think that's from Sanjeet Sierra?
Yes.
Do you guys think that Roy and Heineman are locks for the starting lineup next year? Do you guys think that they will be healthy scratched, or will they start in Laval come October? When it comes to Roy, I think that he's got a good chance of starting in the NHL. I think a good camp should do the trick for him. As for Heineman, he had an up and down season, slowed down by injuries, was probably not as dominating in the AHL as the Canadiens would have hoped him to be. He's still waiver exempt, so that makes he can be sent down, and they're going to that's probably what's going to happen. If he can just raise to the occasion and show that he's ready, he could be a decent mid-season call-up and stay there. But I feel like I said the same thing last year. So it's time for Heineman to take a step up next year, but I don't think that it's going to. I'd be surprised if it happened right from the get-go at training camp.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think barring some sort of phenomenal camp on his part, I would be surprised to see him crack the lineup right out of training camp. You do have to remember that the Canadiens are going to have to do some funky things. When we talk about cracking the lineup out of training camp, the team that cracks the lineup out of training camp is not necessarily the team. I mean, the Canadiens are going to have to do all sorts of cap gymnastics again if they hope to fit Carey Price's salary under the cap to start the year, and then put him on in-season LTIR just like they did last year. There's some things they'll have to do that, but I think Joshua Roy has a much, much, much better chance of being on let's say the opening night lineup for the first game of the season than Heineman does. I think Heineman had a bit of a disappointing year in Laval, all told. Still has the same tools that you like, that the Canadiens like. Plays really more of a North American style game than a European style game. And I think it's going to be a big year for him. His contract is up after next season, I should say, in 2025. So they're going to have to know one way or the other what they're going to do with him by then. So big season for him. But I think he's going to start it in Laval. If he earns it, the Canadiens will be more than happy to bring him up. But Joshua Roy, I think, is going to be in a position, depending on what the Canadiens do this summer. Like if they bring in two kind of top six style forwards, then all bets are off. But I think Joshua Roy is going to open camp with a job to be won or lost. I mean, it's going to be right there for him. And based on everything he's done over his career, I don't see why he wouldn't earn that job out of training camp. I think the Canadiens were really happy with how he was playing before he got hurt with Montreal. Had some nice chemistry with Alex Newhook. Which maybe they will try to rekindle perhaps as a third line next year. Who knows? But I would agree that Joshua Roy, yes, Emil Heineman will need to have a really superlative training camp to be on the team to start the season, at least.
Yeah. Okay, last one from Jimmy La Rochelle. Hello, gentlemen. I was listening to you talk about Silayev in your May 13 podcast episode and was wondering if there's any doubt in the NHL scouting community about Silayev's ability to produce offensively in the best league in the world. I mean, I don't think that there's any... Everybody thinks that Silayev is among the best defensemen available. There's no doubt there. As for his offense translating, we must not forget that he played in the KHL this season as a 17-year-old. Mm-hmm. And actually, he had 3 goals and 8 assists, but that's the most points by an under-18 player in the KHL history.
Yes.
Vladimir Tarasenko at 10.
Back Kaprizov had 8.
Yeah. So he's
Kuznetsov had 8.
It's not so it's those are small numbers but I mean it tells you something about the fact that such a young player was given an opportunity to play a lot and be given a significant role in the KHL, which almost never happens or very rarely. I mean, Mishkov has been playing in Sochi, but he could not crack the lineup in St. Petersburg. Demidov this year was sent down to the MHL. But if you've got a guy, a tower 6'7" defenseman who plays that way in the KHL and does more than hold his own, I understand that it doesn't mean that he's going to be the next Victor Hedman. And I understand that you might want to have like the next coming of the Zdeno Chara, which is, we talked about character earlier. He's in a league of his own. Chara, he had a drive that was very particular to him. So even off the ice, it's hard to compare anybody to Zdeno Chara. But I think that it's the hype around Silayev is warranted.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the point total is a bit misleading, but the reason it's misleading is because he played 63 games in the KHL. As far as U18 players, the next highest ever in the KHL's history is 39 games, which is Anton Silayev as a U18 player. Vlad Tarasenko, who's second in points with 10, had 38 games. Kuznetsov 35, Kaprizov 31. I mean, this is a defenseman playing significant minutes and playing almost basically the entire season as a key contributor on that team is not something to overlook or just ignore, and he's playing for, a competitive team. I believe Igor Larionov is the coach there. And he's obviously cognizant of NHL potential and has been talking this kid up to anyone who will ask. So yes, there's 6'7" notion, or the 6'7" aspect of him makes him, creates the possibility that you're over compensating or you're overvaluing that aspect of him. Could he be the next Tyler Myers? Who knows? Tyler Myers won the Calder, I believe, in his first year. So it's not as if he was a bust, but yeah, it's something to consider. But I think, how difficult it is for young players to crack, not just young defensemen, young players in general, to crack the lineup at the KHL level, added to the fact that he did so consistently throughout the season, I think makes him a pretty intriguing prospect that I would be pretty surprised if he was available at number 5 by the time the Canadiens draft it.
Yeah. I won't start that debate, but I'm not sure that it'd be the guy that I would pick, though, if I was the most.
Oh no, I'm not saying that they would pick, but I just don't think. I'd be surprised if he got past first Anaheim and then Columbus at 4. It would be surprising to me that he'd be available. Whether the Canadiens took him or not is.
I echoed your comment from last week.
Right.
The fact that, they could not completely ignore the fact that he's there I guess they would ask themselves the question for sure.
I mean, if he is there, I do think that there would be a debate. I do. Mm-hmm. I stand by that. I'm not saying that they would necessarily pick him, but if he's there, I think they might have to pivot and consider the possibility.
Well, thanks everybody for your questions. Thanks for listening until the end of this podcast too. We remind you that if you want to send us your questions, you can do so either by email at basuandgodin@gmail.com or on X. Our handle is Basu and Godin. So we're taking questions all through the week. You don't have to wait for our reminder to do so. We didn't even send a reminder this week on X because we had plenty of email questions as it was. So that's great. So we'll be back next Monday, regular programming. In the meantime, Arpin, enjoy your week. Good luck with your writing, and shall go and write some more myself.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.